Hey guys, Mr. Trenhill again. Yesterday we talked about the expectations for online learning and a little brief introduction into Reconstruction. Today we're going to get a little more in depth on Reconstruction. So the first thing, um, just make sure, in case you missed yesterday's video or you don't remember, Reconstruction is the 10-year period after the Civil War ends, and it's bringing our country back together. So the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and so this period is the next 10 years and how they brought the country back together. So the first thing I want to show you guys is the map of the United States. All of these green states up here were all part of the United States. They never left or fought against the U.S. Some of the states were added after the Civil War, like Nebraska, 2 years after, Tennessee, a year after the Civil War ended, and Colorado, about 10 years after the Civil War ended. But none of these green states ever fought against the U.S., so they all stayed a part of the U.S., and never were controlled by the U.S. Army like these other 5 territories I'm about to show you. So these 5 districts were set up by the United States and run by the U.S. Army. So the first one was Virginia. Virginia was the largest southern colony at the time, or southern state at the time, and they weren't readmitted into the United States until 1870, so about 5 years after the Civil War. North Carolina and South Carolina were both readmitted into the U.S. in 1868. They were the second military district. Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were all admitted. Was the third district of the Reconstruction effort run by the U.S. Army. Alabama and Florida were readmitted in 1868, and Georgia in 1870. Next was Arkansas and Mississippi, the fourth district of Reconstruction. 1868 is when Arkansas was readmitted to the U.S., and Mississippi was readmitted in 1870. The last district, the fifth district, was Louisiana and Texas. Louisiana in 1868 and Texas in 1870 is when they were readmitted to the United States. And so all of these states down here are these states that fought against the U.S. in the Civil War. All of them had to go through the process of re-electing people that would run the government the way it was supposed to. They had to follow certain rules, and like I said, the U.S. Army was there to police to make sure those rules were being followed. And then once they went through those steps, they could then be readmitted into the United States. So that's the first thing I want to show you, is that map of what Reconstruction looked like and where it was taking place. Next, I'm going to show you what the cities and towns looked like right after the war. So you guys have to remember that the war was happening for about 4 years. They were fighting, destroying things. People were, being killed, obviously. And so this picture right here shows you a transportation system, their railroad depot in Atlanta, that was so broken down that could not be repaired. It had to be completely torn down to the ground and then rebuilt. So the problem was, for the South at least, that they had all of these goods that had nowhere to go with it. So they would grow their crops and they couldn't take them to market. And so that was a problem that they faced. Also, the Confederate money that they had made was worthless. This country no longer exists, so the money they had made during that time period no longer existed. And then the plantations themselves were also destroyed. This next picture shows you a painting that was done of a southern town. This one would be very similar to what Atlanta, Charleston, Richmond, Columbia, South Carolina looked like, which is in this picture right here. They were partially destroyed. Buildings were collapsed. Crops were burnt. All kinds of things like that. Here is in a railroad in Richmond, Virginia. This is a bridge that goes over a valley of some kind, and it was completely destroyed and needed to be repaired as well. So even if the rest of the track wasn't, this would take many months to repair and get it up and going again. And this last picture shows what looks like a town square. It could have been the courthouse or the town hall. Was completely burned out in the middle of this town. And so it also causes a lot of issues. And so the main problem with Reconstruction is not only are you having to bring people back together as a country after fighting, but you also have all this damage and debt and a bunch of other issues that they're facing as well. And so there were 2 main plans. There was the Lincoln plan on one side, which I'm about to show you, and then there was the Radical Republican plan. The Republicans are the ones in power because the Democrats were part of the South and the Confederacy. And so the Republicans were the ones that were making these decisions. And so Lincoln's plan, which I'm about to show you, included this. It was also known as the 10% plan. So proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, which means that they would not go to war with them again, and they would help reconstruct their country and bring them back. They replaced the majority rule with loyal rule in the South, meaning that if people pledged their loyalty back to the United States, they could rejoin the United States. He didn't want to consult Congress regarding Reconstruction. He wanted to be able to be in charge of it and make decisions quickly so it could be effective and not have to argue amongst all of Congress. He wanted to pardon all the highest ranking military and civilian Confederate officers. People like Robert E. Lee, he wanted to pardon them, forgive them, even though they went to war against the U.S., to help the healing start right away rather than punish them and draw out that healing process. And lastly, like I said, it's called the 10% plan because when 10% of the voting population in 1860 election had taken an oath of loyalty and established a government, it would be recognized as a state. And so that was Lincoln's plan. The next plan was known as the Radical Republicans plan, which we'll talk about in just a second. But before we get to that, we have to talk about why Lincoln's plan wasn't the plan that was used. So Lincoln, 5 days after the Civil War ended in April 9th, 1865. 5 days after that, Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He's going to see a play. The whole country is, especially the North, is celebrating the victory of the Civil War. And a man, John Wilkes Booth, who is this man right here, sneaks into the presidential box and assassinates Abraham Lincoln. His main intention was to try and keep the war going, even though the South had just surrendered and they had given up and they couldn't continue to fight. John Wilkes Booth tried to reignite the war, but it obviously failed, and the war did not continue. And so the last part we're going to talk about is the Radical Reconstruction plan done by the Radical Republicans. It was very harsh. They wanted to punish the Southerners. They wanted to put people in prison. They wanted to execute people. They wanted to punish the South and blame the South for all of the war. Not only did they want to take away, their slaves like they had done with the Emancipation Proclamation and eventually the 13th Amendment, they also wanted to punish the South and make it known that it was their fault that it happened. So they wanted political equality and they wanted economic opportunity to be equal, but they also wanted to punish the South. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is, like I said, they wanted to punish the South. They believed that African Americans should be given the same political rights as white Americans in the United States, and so that was what their goal was. Like I said, it was a very harsh plan. They wanted to punish the South. So the last couple years, or the plan itself lasted a couple years, the Reconstruction plan by the Radical Republicans. They had the U.S. Army there, but eventually the plan kind of fizzled out. They gave up because it wasn't really getting the desired results. And so eventually the U.S. Army pulled out of the South. All of the states that were welcomed back into the U.S. were allowed to do what they wanted. And so that's what we're going to talk about in the next video is what happened in the South and the effect it had on the people living in the South, especially the newly freed African American people. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. See you guys later. Bye.